Dr. Mitchell doesn't know it, but Edgar and I go way back. He lived in New Mexico. I lived in New Mexico. He went to the moon. I dreamed of going to the moon. He founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I subscribe to the journal. But let me talk a little bit in more detail about Edgar's background. He was born in Texas in 1930, went to high school in Roswell, New Mexico, and was there when mysterious events occurred. Later went on to earn his Bachelor of Science in Industrial Management at the Carnegie Institute of Technology in 1952. In 1953, he joined the Navy and became a pilot, and later became a research pilot and taught at the Navy's Research Pilot School. He earned his Master of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School and his PhD in Aeronautics and Astronautics from MIT. In 1966, he was selected to be an astronaut and was forwarded to NASA from the Navy. He trained to be the lunar module pilot and was the backup for Apollo 10. He helped solve the problems that occurred during Apollo 13, and in January 1971, launched on Apollo 14 to become the 6th man to land on the moon. It was the third lunar landing. It took 6 days to get to the moon. February 5th, the Antares lunar module separated from the Kitty Hawk, and they encountered a few problems on the way down. The lunar module computer was getting a faulty abort signal, which had to be patched. They had to reprogram the flight software while in flight. And Edgar Mitchell typed in the 80 key commands necessary to do that, just in the nick of time. And then the lunar altimeter balked at locking in on the lunar surface during a powered descent. And again, in the nick of time, they solved that problem. And Alan Shepard actually landed manually closer than any of the other 6 missions were to land to their target, to their designated target. They had 2 EVAs, 2 moonwalks, totaling a bit over 9 hours. They returned from the moon with over 90 pounds of samples. And on February 9th, they landed in the Pacific Ocean. On the way back from the moon, Edgar has talked about the experiences that he had. It led him to want to investigate human consciousness much more deeply than before. And this is an experience that has been reported by many people who've traveled in space, and most profoundly by those who went out as far as the moon. Because at that distance, you can hold your thumb out and block out the Earth. All of human history, all of human life, everything that we've ever done, blocked out with the tip of your thumb. It gives you a very different perspective on things. He left NASA in 1972, and I'm sorry I don't remember the year, but founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Noetic comes from a Greek word nous, and that is a reference to the sphere of the mind. Growing up, watching the Apollo missions live as a little boy, I was born in 1960, was very, very strongly influenced by that. So I determined to excel in science and math and become an astronaut myself. And that summer of 1971, I made my own spacesuit out of shopping bags and cellophane, and I constructed my own lunar module out of patio furniture. And then years later, I decided I didn't want to be an astronaut because that meant going into the military, and that had become something that I couldn't do at the time. Anyway, a few years after that, I discovered the Institute of Noetic Sciences. It was located in Sausalito, California, just south of where I lived in San Rafael. And so I started subscribing to the journal and learned some amazing things. There's so much that we don't understand about how our minds work and how consciousness works and how it all ties in with our sense of the divine and the spiritual. And so that exploration has become the counterpoint to that hard physical science exploration of the outer world. There's that more mysterious inner world that we're all very curious about. So I think with that, I will hand the mic over. That was a strange one.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm pleased to be with you today. That photo that you see on the screen before you of Earth from space is one of the few taken from that perspective. Actually, it's an Apollo 10 photo because only Apollo 8 and Apollo 10 had the sun at their backs when they were coming back to Earth, and so they could get a full Earth picture. But it was projected in 1958, at the very beginning of the space program, that if we ever got a picture of Earth from space, like that one, life would never be the same again. And that is true, because since that picture, and a couple of others like it made from Apollo 8 and more from Apollo 10, there hasn't been hardly a day in the history of publications or television in any place in the world in the major cities where some picture like this has not been in the local media of either the print media or the electronic media to help remind us just what this Earth looks like when you get out in space. And all of us who have been to space, to the moon in particular, have seen this. And I recommend to you, for example, as I will describe this morning, my own experience, but there has been a book written by Frank White called The Overview Effect that is kind of the collection of all of our impressions on seeing this and the change in experience and the change in thinking that's caused by seeing this from space. So without further ado and other further comment, we will go forward here, and we will talk about one path to the moon, namely my own, and my story. And it started out in the early years, 1934 to be exact. I grew up on ranches and farms in New Mexico, and born in Texas, grew up in New Mexico in the Roswell area, the Pecos Valley. And this was my first pony. And my parents and grandparents were cattlemen. And so that's what I was destined to be at 4 years old. But I decided, since I had to drive a tractor and bale hay, and I got hay fever from that, I decided I didn't want to do that in my life. So we went forward from there. But anyhow, I started flying very early in my life. I started washing airplanes at the local airfield to earn flight time so I could get a pilot's license. So by 1943, when I was 13, I was flying a J3 Piper Cub and got my pilot's license by the time I was 16 and went off to college to Carnegie Tech in 1948. And we will talk about, if you want to at some point, 1947, an incident occurred in the Roswell area. And then one day in the newspaper, it said an aliens have landed, and it was in the Roswell Daily Record. The next day there was a retraction of that and said, no, it was a weather balloon. And that's a different story. We can talk about it a little later time. Anyhow, it so happens that in 1952, when I graduated from Carnegie, the Korean War was on, and the draft was on, and the local draft board in New Mexico said, we want you. And I said, no, you don't want me. If I'm gonna, I don't mind serving my country, but I will want to do it on my terms. So to get to fly, I enlisted in the Navy and then got a commission as an officer and went off to flight training after that. And so I got to flight training in Pensacola in 1953, got my Navy wings at that point, and that's skipping ahead a little bit. I went in the Navy training. You obviously got carrier training, and so in the early 50s, I was paying my duty to the country and to the Navy for my training and my commission. And it so happens I was coming back from the Pacific in 1957 aboard a Navy aircraft carrier, the USS Ticonderoga, and with that aircraft, which happened to have my name on it. And does anybody, some of you older folks and professors may remember, but do you know what happened on October the 4th, 1957? Well, that was the day Sputnik was launched. Now, even though I did not really plan in my career to have a military career, nor even a career in aviation, I was headed for industry, I thought. But suddenly that event changed my mind as I realized that the worldview of humanity would be shifted at that point, that space was a new frontier, and I wanted to be a part of it. So I came back, I was coming back to test pilot duty from this tour in 1957, and the Navy test facility at China Lake, California, where I was doing flight testing of concepts and flight techniques in different aircraft. But I realized that the astronauts were being selected, and I was a bit younger and a little less experienced than the older guys that were being selected. Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom and the fellows were being selected in the late 50s. And I realized that to compete and to get a part, I would need a little more test pilot experience and a little more education. So I went back then, I got my way back to graduate school again. And it so happens that right after the beginning of the space world, and President Eisenhower had formed NASA from NACA, the National Aeronautics Committee, that they had designated MIT, Caltech, and Princeton as asked them to set up graduate programs so we would know what space was all about. Very frankly, young people, at that point in 1957, our knowledge of space and astronomy and what was out there was about as sophisticated as God in the heavens, man in the middle, and everything else below. We really didn't know what space was all about. And so it was the task of these three leading universities to start educating young people about it. And I was fortunate enough to be in the second class that went to MIT to get a doctorate in what is space all about. And from that, I was assigned to go back, and I ended up at Edwards Air Force Base as an instructor, but I got to fly pretty exotic aircraft with the Air Force at Edwards in the period of 1965 and 66. And so from there, I was selected into the astronaut program in 1966, particularly for the Apollo missions. Now, however, in 1966, the Apollo craft had not been flown in space. We did not know whether we could recover it, that spacecraft, where we wanted to recover it. So those of us who were in the program had to go through different survival courses. And here's a picture of us going through jungle survival, where we learned how to survive in the jungle for a week with nothing but what we could find for ourselves to eat and take care of ourselves for a week while they located us. And we did survival training in the jungle, in the desert, and on water, because nobody knew where we were going to come down at that point in the design of spacecraft. However, and then there's a picture of training at sea in a simulation of the Apollo command module. But then I was selected, this is long story short, I was initially selected for the Apollo 13 crew because of the way our rotation was set up in those days. I served backup on Apollo 10, and that meant 3 flights later I would be eligible for a prime crew assignment, which would mean Apollo 13. However, I served backup with Gordon Cooper, who wanted to retire from the program after that. And so we were on Apollo 13, would have been on Apollo 13 together, but Gordon retired. And Alan Shepard, who was our first guy in space, had only a suborbital flight, wanted to take over and he had a medical problem resolved, and he wanted to get back on flight status. And so he took on Gordon's spot and on Apollo 13. However, headquarters in Washington said, Alan, you haven't been in the training loop recently. Perhaps best you and Jim Lovell's crew shift missions. They had 14. We had 13. They got a bad machine. We didn't want to do that, but headquarters kind of insisted, and you didn't argue with the boss. So they got 13, we took 14. They got a bad machine, we got a good machine. And that also left the issue that I was the most senior lunar module pilot on the ground at that time. How many got to see Apollo 13 movie? Quite a few of you. Well, if you'll remember in that movie, the command module pilot of Apollo 13, Ken Mattingly, who was a very, very close friend, got bounced from the flight because he had been exposed to the measles of Charlie Chuke's kids, well, another astronaut. And the medics were afraid he would come down with the measles in flight, and so they didn't want him to fly Apollo 13. So his backup took his place, but he and I were the two senior pilots on the command module and lunar module, respectively, on the ground when Apollo 13 blew up in space. So our job was to bring them back and to do what they needed to do in the simulators to make sure we knew what to do and could radio up to them anything we found. Ken had the problem back the command module through the atmosphere when there wasn't enough fuel really to bring it back and enough power up on board. And he found a way to do that. And I had to try out everything that they would have to do using the lunar module as a lifeboat, tugboat, to bring them home, to make sure there wasn't any surprises we'd have to deal with on the way home. So that was our task on Apollo 13. However, we were on Apollo 14, and our crew, the crew of Apollo 14, was myself on the right, Stuart Rusa in front, down left, who was our command module pilot, and Alan Shepard, who had flown the abort mission, the short mission in space at the beginning, who was our commander. And here's a picture of Apollo 14 going to the launch pad. How many of you in this room have been to Cape Kennedy and been to the Apollo Museum there? Not very many of you, but a few of you. So you will realize, those of you who haven't will know that if you look at this picture, the Apollo craft with the Saturn V launch vehicle is 363 feet long, a little over a football field long. To get a picture of you can just barely see people, and you can see some vehicles down at the bottom of this to give you some sense of size. Those of you who have been to the Saturn V Museum have had a chance to look at this monstrous vehicle and realize just how huge it really is. And this is what it looks like at night. Impressive, impressive out on the launch pad with all the lights on it as the crews get it ready to go. And then I'm simulating a launch here, but because I want to show you something. I want to show you something here that is quite interesting. What I want to show you here is take a look at the first thing any of us going into space get to see as we launch off the Earth, and look at here the thin rim of space that is our protector from empty space on Earth. That's the atmosphere. That is a sensible, visible atmosphere. That's about a little over 100,000 feet, and the real atmosphere gets thinner and thinner out to about here. But when you're coming back through the atmosphere in a spacecraft at 36,000 feet per second, crashing into it, the G-force crashing into that builds up to about 7 Gs for a very short period of time. But my point in pointing this out to you is to get a look at just how thin that atmosphere is that protects us from the vacancy and the emptiness of outer space. This is a mock-up showing how the command module and the lunar module fit together to go out in the translunar portion of the flight to go on out to the moon, with the lunar module docked into the nose of the command module, and then and there's a tunnel between them so we can get in between them. And then when we get into space, whether we get to the moon, we separate them, and the two of us, Shepard and myself, went down to the surface. What I want to point out in this particular picture, this slide, look at this is the front side of the moon that you always see from Earth, and look at the dark craters. The ancients thought these were oceans, and they called them mare, after the French word for sea or ocean. And they thought what it was oceans. It turns out it's lava. And the backside, which we never get to see from Earth, doesn't look like this at all, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But what I want you to see from this picture as well, look at the polar regions where you're getting virtually a 3D view of what the terrain looks like. It really looks kind of the same everywhere, but you're only because you're only seeing virtually in 3D the polar regions, the roughness of this terrain at that point. The next slide shows all the landing sites on here, and that's ours, Apollo 14, but you see Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 that we across the front side of the moon, representing the 6 flights that landed on the moon. And if we start to get in close to the moon, this is what it looks like as we approached it, going around the left side or the west side of the moon as we come from Earth. As you can see, these major craters, big craters, and then smaller craters and smaller craters, till you get down, actually land on the moon. You see craters the size of raindrops, like it's a raindrop pattern. So since there is no atmosphere on the moon to destroy these craters, they've been there for billions and billions of years. And those on the front side, and we'll show that to you a little better in a moment, this is kind of halfway, not on the front side, but going around the back side. And so you don't see all of the lava in these craters that you would when you see the front side of the moon. But here is, if we go around, this is their first picture of taking Earth, a picture of Earth as you go around behind the moon and Earth starts to come up on the other side. This is a picture of Earthrise. As you can see, it's not a full Earth like I showed you in the very first slide, but it's kind of like a half moon or a waning Earth. And you see here on the back side of the moon, this just looks like pure old dirt, the same way it is on Earth, without any vegetation on it. But there's still cratering on the back side of the moon, except the lava hasn't flown out on the back side of the moon like it does on the front side of the moon, because the moon is a little bit oblong, and the gravitational pull of the Earth has brought the lava out on to the front side of the moon. This is a more recent photo of our particular landing site on Apollo 14. This particular crater is called Cone Crater. It was the subject of our investigation. Here is where our proposed landing site was, and that's about 2,500 kilometers, 2.5 kilometers, not 25, but 2,500 meters from here out and back. And this little area is called Cone Crater, and it was what the geologists wanted us to really take a look at and to gather data from. This crater is about 1,000 feet across and about 800 feet deep. Now, when a meteor plows into a surface like this, it turns out a plume of soil and rock, kind of like this, with the deepest material being distributed right around the edge of the crater, and the shallower material being distributed out along a ray in here. And that's what the geologists wanted us to do, was to sample what came out of this crater by getting data from soil and rock from where we landed out to the top of the crater, which is what we did. And we ended up bringing back about 95 pounds of samples from there, but we'll look at that in a minute. We'll go on. Here is a simulation of the landing of Antares, of course, and in the background you see the sun shining through. Oh, that's a high gain antenna. We deliberately landed with the sun very low in the eastern sky, so we had long shadows that we could see to help us guide our landing, so we could see our shadow. You see here just the slope of Cone Crater. That was our target on the second extravehicular activity period, off behind us here. And this is a picture taken of the lunar module shortly after we landed. But first things first, as soon as we landed, our first job was to set up the American flag and take our pictures with it. And that's a picture of me taken by Alan Shepard. And you can see in the background here, that is the high gain antenna that was broadcasting our voices and everything, and the television. We had a good television, the first good television on the moon, and the television signal that Walter Cronkite and the other reporters on Earth were getting from our television camera. This is a picture of here. That's a picture of the lunar module of the shadow, and my partner who's taking the picture. But you can see the long, long shadow of the lunar module, which helped us as we were making the approach. We could see just how we were looking as we came down with the sun at our back this way. Here is a layout of the landing site. Our first EVA activity was out in front of the lunar module, right in this period, where we set up science instruments to measure various things that the scientists wanted to have broadcast back to Earth, and we'll show a picture of that in a minute. Our second EVA, the second day, was to go up, do a geology trek up to the top of Cone Crater and back, gathering samples and data along the way. This particular object is called the Modular Equipment Transporter. It's a little two-wheeled, like a golf cart, that we had to pull along. The guys after us had a motorized vehicle they could ride, so they could go further than we could. We had to walk up to Cone Crater and pull this along with us. And so that's the first two-wheel vehicle on the moon. This is a picture of my partner. You can tell us apart. By our flight, they couldn't tell us apart in the earlier two missions. So we marked our suits. The commander had a red stripe on his helmet and red bands around his arms, and the lunar module pilot just had the white suit on. That was how they told us apart in the camera and the photos, because they couldn't otherwise. And here's the tracks of out in front of the lunar module in the background, and the tracks of the Met as we go out to the science station, where we set up and set the science station up. That we're still broadcasting back to Earth 14 years later. As a matter of fact, I'll show you the one. You can't see it clearly here, but we also set up a laser reflector. All of these various pieces of equipment that collected solar particles and different radiation from the moon. And I did a experiment with the thumper that was a local seismic experiment that fired a shotgun shell and a little hammer of a plate into there, so we could get local seismic data that was broadcast through that antenna back to Earth. And that lunar laser reflector represented there was still operating even now. The rest of the equipment lasted about 14 years, and they shut it off in the 1980s. But the laser reflector was still operating last year, and they determined after measuring all these years that the orbit of the moon had not changed but just a few meters, millimeters rather, over the period of this experiment. So it's been, the lunar orbit's been pretty darn stable. Now, yes, it has a perigee and an apogee. It's not perfectly circular, but it's very, very stable. This is a picture of myself. What I wanted to point out here, one of the things that was a problem that we didn't ever get lost on this going up Cone Crater, but it was very difficult to tell exactly where we were. The geologists wanted to know our position quite precisely. And it turns out, since if you go in the desert, one sand dune looks about like another sand dune. It's very hard to tell precisely where you are until you're right on top of a particular landmark. So only after the flight, and when we took panoramic shots, photographic shots, they could backtrack us, and we were right where we were supposed to be, but we didn't always know it when we were doing it actually. So here's a picture of myself looking at a lunar map, trying to figure out exactly where we are, heading up to the top of Cone Crater. But one of the things you notice here, look at the legs of my pressure suit, absolutely covered with dust, and our command module pilots were very unhappy with us coming back into any spacecraft with a lot of this stuff on, but trying to get it off and get ourselves cleaned up before we got into the lunar module, and particularly before the command module pilots let us back into the command module. It was quite a chore getting ourselves cleaned up. If we get up to the rim of Cone Crater where we were headed, as you see, you can't really see it here, but the lunar module is right behind, over the rim there, not out of sight. But what you're seeing is the increase in the density of big rocks as you get closer to the top. And we were up here sampling all of this. And then right on the very edge of Cone Crater, this are some very, very large rocks you can see. And what was interesting, and these would come from the deepest part of the crater, and it had white material in it that the geologists were very, very interested in. So here you see a picture of the little sampling bag that I used and my geology hammer where I chipped off some pieces of that white rock to take back to the geologists so they could play around with the various compositions of what all of this material is. But these particular rocks represent 900 feet deep into the lunar soil from Cone Crater. And so here we go, we rush on back down to Antares, and I'm out adjusting the television camera where I'm at this particular point in time, and that is a picture of from the television camera of Alan approaching the lunar module. And this is an interesting shot because one of the experiments that we set up was a solar wind collector, it's called, and it really just looks like a window shade stretched out on a pole. And this was designed by a Swiss physicist, and we rolled that up when we were getting all our data put together. We rolled that up like a window shade, stuck it in our collection box, and that left this pole standing there. Now, why is that important? Well, as some of the older folks here that watched it may know, my partner decided to take along a golf club of a head of a golf club, and took a couple of whacks at a golf ball on the moon using as a shank of the golf club one of the pieces of equipment, that a scoop that we picked up soil, and he put his golf club on the head of that and took a whack at a golf ball. So he managed out of 3 shots, he managed one hand and without 2 hands and in a pressure suit. He managed to connect enough to knock it out into a little crater ahead of it. And I took that one staff that had the solar wind experiment and threw it after his golf ball. And if you look very carefully, there's his golf ball, about 4 or 5 inches short. Now, throughout all of the talking and our debriefing, the story was when people asked him, how far did the golf ball go, Alan? And it started out miles and miles, and then miles and miles and miles, and I would have to pull out this photo and say, Alan, miles and miles is quite enough for 51 feet, because that's how far it went. In any event, here we are getting ready to go home, and here's a picture of the lunar module, just as taken from the television camera, just as we fired the launch, powered the engines up, and blew the hold-down bolts. and all of this debris is shooting out, and that picture is being sent back. It's the last picture that came from the moon. And we go on up and we start to dock with our command module. So here's the command module we're getting close to, above the lunar surface. And this is clearly the backside of the moon, because doesn't have the black lava rock that you see on the front side. And here's after we've docked and we have turned loose of Antares, and it was going to be used, like all of the lunar modules, be used as a seismic hammer to crash into the moon. Now, we only had 2 seismometers on the moon, Apollo 12 and Apollo 14 at that point, but all the rest of the missions later put more seismometers across the front of the moon, and we crashed the lunar modules into them at certain strategic points so the geologists could get seismic readings from the inside of the moon. And that was the fate of the lunar modules after we had finished using them to go down to the surface. So this is goodbye Antares. And here's a couple of interesting things. Here's some of the parting views. What you're looking at here is probably a collapsed lava tube about the size of the Grand Canyon. And this picture would be around, not totally on the backside, but on probably the right eastern border of the moon, of where this is probably a lava tube that has collapsed. And this next picture would be where you can see a little different perspective of a crater filled with lava, but obviously there wasn't a lava tube filling that one. So just a little bit of lunar geology and what we were experiencing from this series of slides. And from there, we're homeward bound in the command module. This is obviously taken from a lunar module, a picture of the command module from a lunar module, not ours, but that was what we looked like coming home without the lunar module, but in the command module itself. Okay, I'll let you read this. On the return trip home, gazing through the 240 miles of space toward the stars and the planet from which I had come, I suddenly experienced the universe as intelligent, loving, and harmonious. Now, let me set this up for you, because this is rather important. It leads to a number of things. When we came home, we were in the plane of the ecliptic, which, as you know, the definition is the plane that contains the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. But we were perpendicular to the ecliptic and rotating to keep thermal balance on the spacecraft. So we were flying sideways like this while we were rotating. And what that caused to happen was every 2 minutes, since we were rotating once every 2 minutes, that caused a picture of the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and a 360-degree panorama of the heavens to appear in the spacecraft port every 2 minutes. And I'm going to try to simulate that for you because it's a powerful, powerful experience. And you see in space, because of the lack of the intervening atmosphere, when you're looking at these pictures of Earth and the heavens, it's much closer to what you see from the Hubble telescope, because the stars are 10 times as bright or 10 times as numerous as you can see on the highest mountain with the naked eye from here on the surface of the Earth. So I'm going to try, it's not an awfully good simulation, but I'm going to try to show you what this is like by pretending to move move the scenery. Now, let me, before I start showing you this, I realized upon seeing this, what you're going to see, I realized as I was looking at it, remember, my job as being lunar module pilot and in charge of the surface activities on the lunar module, my job was largely done on the way home. So I was kind of a tourist looking out the spacecraft window, and but I still was monitoring the spacecraft instruments coming home. But we still had some work to do, but my job was pretty light load coming home. So I had time to look at all of this. And I realized as I watched this that we humans that have been asking questions forever about our origin. Who are we? How did we get here? Where are we going? What's this really all about? Where did it come from? In other words, the deep cosmological and philosophic questions. And because we were getting, as humans, the first opportunity to see ourselves from a different perspective, this was very powerful for me. And I realized that our story of ourselves, as deciphered by science, was probably flawed and incomplete. And that the story of ourselves as told by our cultural cosmology, normally rooted in our religions, were archaic and probably flawed. And that perhaps that was really what we needed to be looked at. And at this point in time, because as the first spacefarers from Earth, we really didn't know what the answer to those very deep questions that humans have been asking forever. And fundamentally, we didn't answer those questions of why did we know at all what it was? What is awareness? What is consciousness? Where did it come from? Well, I'll get into that in our next lecture after this in a little while. But let me try to simulate, just very roughly and briefly, what was happening as we were coming home. And so here we are, presumably rotating with the moon coming across the horizon with star field background, Earth coming across the star field background, the sun coming across the star field background, the moon again as we do another 360-degree rotation, and then eventually we get home after 3 days of watching this for 3 days and start to see this picture of home as we get close in. Splash down in the Pacific, entering the atmosphere at 36,000 feet per second, or in other words, 25,000 miles an hour, and splashing into the Pacific near Pago Pago. And being picked up by the aircraft carrier, the USS New Orleans. And that's the end of that story.